All right, looks like it's time for us to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Northwest ATTC webinar. I'm Jennifer Verbeck, and I'm your host for today. We're excited to have Norma Jaeger presenting for us today on recovery capital and resilience, head and tail of the same coin. Next slide, please. Couple of quick housekeeping things. First, if you have any questions for our presenter, please type them into the chat box at any time and we'll try to answer some as we go along. And whatever we can't get to, we'll answer at the end of the presentation. Next slide. You'll also be getting an email at the end of today's webinar that has a link to a survey in it. Please take that survey as it helps us make sure we're bringing you the content you're interested in. And it also helps us continue offering free or low-cost events such as this one. That email will also have a link to download the slides from today and a link to our website where you'll be able to find a recording. And that should be available later this afternoon. Additionally, we'll be sending everyone who attends this live webinar a certificate of attendance, and it takes us about a week to get those out. You don't need to do anything to get the certificate unless you're watching this in a group. If that's the case, please have someone in the group email us within a business day with the names and email addresses for everyone who wants a certificate. And our email address is up there in the slide. It's northwest@attcnetwork.org. Next slide. And now on to our webinar. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Norma Jaeger, who has 30 years experience managing and evaluating addiction and mental health programs in Northern Idaho, Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington. She developed addiction and mental health programs for pregnant and postpartum women's, children's mental health programs, and several programs for individuals in the criminal justice system. She was the program manager for offender programming at the Idaho Department of Corrections and a statewide coordinator for expansion and support to Idaho's 70-plus drug, mental health, and veterans courts, as well as providing consultation to treatment courts and related conferences throughout the country. And with that, I'll turn it over to Norma to expand on that introduction. Thank you, Norma, for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. This is a subject that is very, very dear to my heart. It's something that has formed the last really about 4 or 5 years of my career work, and I'm really excited to share it with you today. Before we start, though, I do want to acknowledge that, we are all operating on lands that have been occupied and dealt with by indigenous populations across our states. And to acknowledge that land and to acknowledge the importance of reaching out across our various practices to individuals that represent all of the populations that are so important in our states. You can find an interactive map if you're curious about the land that you are on and which tribes have historically been there. You can find that interactive map on the ATTC website. So with that acknowledgement, let's move forward. I do want to tell you just a little bit more about myself, but I'm going to go through it a little quickly because we've got a lot to cover today. I come a bit late, really, but enthusiastically to this world of recovery. I spent 6 years working in mental health in Idaho, way back when in the early part of my career, and then the 23 years working in substance use disorder prevention and treatment in Idaho, in Portland and Seattle. I returned to Idaho in the year 2000, and in 2001 went to work for the Department of Correction, helping them to implement various programming related to recovery in their institutions. In 2002, I moved on to the Idaho Supreme Court and worked, and worked with them as they expanded treatment courts across the state of Idaho. And then my journey in the recovery world, in 2006, I really became acquainted with a person who was really advocating for and supporting the development of peer support within the mental health courts in our state. We developed 3 endorsement trainings for peer support specialists, including in criminal justice and co-occurring disorders and crisis services. Then in 2016, I became the Director of Recovery Idaho, which is a statewide recovery community organization. In 2022, I was asked to be a field reviewer on TIP 64, and you can Google that, and I think there'll be a slide that talks about TIP 64, but it's really it's very detailed, and it's an excellent guide to incorporating peer support, recovery coaches into substance use disorder treatment services. I also was asked to serve on the expert panel on trauma and peer support in treatment courts, which will be released one of these days quite soon. And then co-chair of the Idaho Governor's Office on Drug Policy Recovery Subcommittee. So this opportunity to kind of work in the recovery area is fairly new for me, but it's one that I think is going to hold a lot of promise for outcomes that we're all working toward. So let's kind of jump into recovery and talk a bit about what is recovery. SAMHSA has come up with a definition after really some major kind of consensus groups and focus groups and outreach to the field. And they define recovery as a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed, and I have to add, I added the word pro-social because of all the work that I think all of us do interfacing with the criminal justice system. So a self-directed pro-social life and strive to reach their full potential. I think that really sets the stage as we talk about recovery and as we talk about resilience, which I say are 2 sides of the same coin. At one time, recovery, when we use the term, it was simply synonymous with Alcoholics Anonymous and then later Narcotics Anonymous. The recovery movement as a movement is not new. CCAR, the Connecticut Community for Addiction Recovery, was established in 1998. When you do the math, it's kind of a shock that 1998 was 25 years ago. Faces and Voices of Recovery came along in 2001. There was a Recovery Bill of Rights that was published by Faces and Voices of Recovery. In 2008, Anonymous People, a great film. If you haven't seen it, you can Google that. You can find trailers. You can find ways to actually access the film. Anonymous People was shown in 2013. Recovery Idaho started in 2015, and the 9 recovery community centers came along between 2015 and 2017. There are recovery organizations throughout our geographic area, the Northwest. recoveralaska.org. The Idaho Behavioral Health Council established recovery as a priority element of our behavioral health continuum in 2023. OregonRecovers.org and OregonRecoveryNetwork.org. Between Alaska, Oregon, and Peer Washington, Peer, WAORG, really tells you about the broad coalitions that have developed and the advocacy in recovery as an important aspect of a recovery-oriented system of care and the behavioral health continuum. So we were really excited when the Governor's Office of Drug Policy actually established a recovery strategic plan subcommittee in 2023. This has been a huge step in the recognition of the importance of recovery as a critical element of the continuum. So when SAMHSA looks at recovery, they talk about 4 dimensions. And I think these are really important because often in substance use disorder treatment, we tend to focus pretty much on whether or not a person is able to develop and maintain abstinence and, move on a bit in their lives. But we don't always recognize these 4 dimensions of recovery: health, home, purpose, meaningful, and again, I add the term pro-social, daily activities, and the independence, income, and resources to participate in society. And when we talk about recovery capital, we're really talking about the resources to participate in society. And then finally, community, the critical importance of relationships and social networks that provide support, friendship, love, and probably most importantly, provide hope. So again, from the work that SAMHSA has done, recovery principles, self-direction, that people have the right to decide how recovery looks in their life, what it means in their life, and how they're going to get there. It's individualized and person-centered. Over the years, we've talked about cookie cutter programs. Recovery is not about a cookie cutter program. Empowerment, it's holistic. Again, looking at those 4 dimensions, recovery exists in all of those dimensions. It's nonlinear. We understand that people move around within the recovery continuum, that they try different pathways, that they hit speed bumps along the way, they have setbacks. But that doesn't mean that they're not still on a pathway to recovery if they choose to do so. It's culturally based, going back to our land acknowledgement, understanding the role of culture and what that means in a person's picture and idea and support system for recovery. It's strengths-based. It's based on peer support. I don't know that there's anything, more significant than the development of the peer support process in recovery. We'll talk more about that. Relationships, reestablishing positive, pro-social, supportive relationships, family and community, respect, responsibility, that individuals, it's kind of in a way, the other side of the empowerment coin. Responsibility is that the individual has the power and has the responsibility to pursue and to seek their own individualized recovery. And finally, and most importantly of all, the recovery principle of hope, that hope is what drives recovery. Hope is what generates change. The belief that tomorrow can be different than today is what makes recovery possible. So I really believe that focusing on recovery can be a game changer in terms of the work that we do. What can we do? First of all, we can provide a concrete vision of long-term recovery. That's a little different than telling someone, this is what you have to do for the rest of your life. Sometimes, especially early in recovery, early in treatment, when people are told, this is the path that you have to be on for the rest of your life, that can be a bit daunting and maybe discouraging. But providing a concrete vision of long-term recovery, helping people understand that recovery is a lifetime, that where they will be in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years in long-term recovery is a life that maybe today they can't even imagine. And I'm sure you've all heard people say who are in recovery, I never dreamed that my life could be like this. So providing that concrete vision, recognizing and exploring many pathways with people, recognizing that there is no one single way to recovery. People may need to experiment. They may need to find, they may need to try different ways to approach recovery. Understanding the dimensions of recovery, those 4 dimensions that we talked about: home, health, purpose, community, and developing real plans and identifying real resources in all of those 4 dimensions. Truly focus on recovery maintenance tools. You know, I've heard it said over and over and over again, and I'm sure you have. I'm sure I've said it over and over again. Now you've got the tools. You know, go forth, go live a good life, but you've got the tools now, so use them. I don't think we do a very good job with really helping people with the tools. I have visions of this big red toolbox that we give people, and we say, okay, here's the tools, go use them, without really giving them a complete opportunity to practice with those tools, to become good with those tools, to master the use of those tools. And of course, part of that happens after they leave our treatment programs. Part of that happens in the real world, but helping people engage with those tools during the time they're in our treatment programs and early in our recovery programs, that's really critical if we're going to keep saying, okay, now you've got the tools, go use them. And finally, helping people to make deposits to what I call the bank of recovery capital. And we're going to talk about recovery capital in detail, but working with people to help them see what recovery capital looks like and how they can begin to build it and how they can begin to make those deposits. And really having enough deposits in the bank of your recovery capital is what gives you, to a great extent, resilience. So what is recovery capital? Recovery capital started as an addiction treatment concept developed and introduced by Granfield and Cloud in 1999. So, you know, when you do that math, that was a long time ago. William White, I hope you all know the William White papers. William White, who has done extensive work in the area of recovery with Hazelden, precisely defines this concept as the breadth and the depth of internal and external resources that can be drawn upon to initiate and sustain recovery. And I would add to that, and provide you with resilience. Recovery applies to substance use. It also applies to mental illness and to trauma. We understand increasingly the interrelationships of those elements. But when we talk about recovery, we can be talking about substance use, we can be talking about mental illness, we can be talking about trauma, because recovery is possible in all those areas. So here's a fun little diagram, a little scheme of recovery capital, you know, what it looks like. So recovery capital, as William White said, it's the breadth. You know, how wide is your recovery capital? Do you have recovery capital in all those areas? And the depth. So let's say that spirituality is one element of your recovery capital. That's more than simply participating in a program that identifies itself as spiritual. It's more than, let's say, just attending church. It's more than simply occasionally reading an article or using a day at a time planner that talks about spiritual principles. It's really being in touch with your spirituality, with your spiritual foundation, with other people who share that, who can reflect back to you. If we're talking about health, it's more than an annual checkup. When we look at the depth of health, it's understanding that how we eat, how we exercise, how we sleep, all of those things are elements of health. It's how we engage in all of the developed preventive health practices. And it's how we regard the importance of our health and how that interacts with our recovery. So that's both breadth and depth. Certainly leisure over on the left-hand side. Leisure, how we spend our time renewing ourselves, how we spend our time relaxing, dealing with stress, the social activities we have, being part of a local recovery community. All of these add to the scope, to the breadth, as well as have elements that add to the depth of recovery capital. And, ideally, we could make a list of those things, and we could list something. We could work with someone to help them list something in each one of those areas. And as they do so, their resilience, their ability to withstand setbacks, their ability to manage disappointments, they come to all of us, are expanded. And that becomes both their recovery capital and their resilience in the face of challenges that life brings. So how can helpers, how can counselors, how can case managers, how can other people who are helpers in the life of someone seeking recovery, how can they help them actually build their recovery capital? So there are 4 elements of recovery capital. There's personal recovery capital. So an individual's health, their financial assets, their ability to earn money, their ability to budget, to save money, having health insurance, their ability to live in safe and sober housing. Not necessarily organized safe and sober housing, although we know how important that is and how we all need to be advocates for increasing safe and sober housing. But living in a safe place with people who support you in your recovery, healthy food, transportation. So those are kind of personal recovery capital elements. Human recovery capital involves pro-social values, knowledge, education, and vocational skills and credentials, problem-solving capabilities, negotiation and advocacy skills. We want people to be able to get their needs met in ways that are most likely to be personally as well as socially acceptable and supported. Self-efficacy, learning that a person is able to be successful at the things that they do, at using those tools. Part of human recovery capital is being successful at using the tools of recovery that we talk about. Hopefulness, a belief with optimism that I'm on a journey and the destination that I am headed toward is one that is worthwhile, one that is attractive to me, and one that I believe I can reach if I put forth the effort. And finally, purpose. Purpose is an important aspect of human recovery capital. Believing that we have value to other people, we have value in our community, that our life serves a purpose, an opportunity to be a good example to other people. Another dimension of recovery capital is social recovery capital. The first 2 things, I suppose you could pursue pretty much independently. You could work on all of those things all by yourself. But the other aspect of recovery capital is social recovery capital, your relationships with other people, particularly other people in a supportive network, a group that is engaged in being important resources in the community, in helping others, in reaching out to others, having role models. That's where the recovery movement and being part of a true recovery community gives you role models. When you see someone, the other day I happened to be in contact with a woman who has a very responsible position in public health in Idaho. We were talking about developing a coalition to pursue another one of my sort of soapbox activities, which is helping people to address issues related to tobacco and smoking. But anyway, she was talking to me about what we were going to do and a position that she had been contracted with by the state to do some very important work. And in that process, she mentioned to me, and by the way, 35 years ago, I was a very hopeless, I guess, heroin addict. I was a heroin addict for 10 years. She is a role model. She is living the life that, her 35, 40 years ago person could not have even imagined living. She is fulfilling responsible roles in the community that a 10-year heroin addict could never have imagined living. But that kind of role model and people being willing to self-disclose their struggles, their histories of addiction, and their histories of mental illness. They are all around us, people that we know, people that we love, people that we are in contact with all the time, and have no idea that they are role models of recovery. Social recovery capital includes emotional support from people who can identify that, you're having a tough time, and they say to you, I'm here. I hold place for you. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm just going to be there for you. And if you need to talk to me, if you need to vent, if you need to share the struggles you're having, I'm here. I'm holding place for you. And finally, social capital includes access to information, being able to know where to go, who to go to, what you need when you get there, in order to access the myriad of resources that exist in the community that can support you in your recovery journey. The final element of recovery capital we call community recovery capital. And that is being in a community that has employment and education and training opportunities, that has housing options, that has health assessment and care services, peer support groups, guidance to the multiple pathways of recovery. That is where our recovery community centers, our organized recovery movement, is fulfilling and helping to provide people with community recovery capital. And having it available in the community does no one any good if no one knows about it. And so sharing the information about that recovery capital that's available to people. So I'm going to go through kind of some of the questions. We might not read them all, but I have a terrible time when it's up there on the screen. I have this tendency to read it, but nevertheless, this is a checklist that's available. It will be available to you online through the ATTC after this webinar. And it's a checklist that we developed here in Idaho. The good thing about this checklist is we designed it to be something that could show significant improvement, significant additions to recovery capital in a period of 90 days. So working with someone and maintaining contact, and then looking at the things that they currently have and where they may want to work on increasing their recovery capital, you can see change in 90 days. You can probably see change in 30 days, but we designed it with the idea that as we were doing some evaluation of programs and the work of recovery community centers, but it would work equally well in any other kind of treatment or treatment court environment. It is something that people can show a change in their score within 90 days. And if any of you have happened to receive something about your credit score, and your credit score has changed, and how did it change, and how you can change your credit score, this is like that, how you can improve your recovery capital score. And you add them up at the end, and see how much. I would say add them up at the end, the number of check marks at the end, multiply by 2 or 3, so that people can see that their existing recovery capital is not non-existent. They do have recovery capital, and they can build on it, and they can add to it. So I live in an environment that is free from alcohol and other drugs. That kind of gets at our housing and our sober housing situation. I have an intimate partner that is supportive of my recovery. We know in the work that we do that relationships where one partner is attempting recovery and the other isn't, how much of a challenge that could be. So someone might not put a check mark there. They may be estranged from their family. They may have a family that's really deeply engaged in addiction. And so, that may not be a check mark, or it may be. I have friends who are supportive. I have people close to me who are also in recovery, understanding that issue of role models. I have a job or other income support that provides for my basic needs. I have a written plan for my recovery, and I'll put in a pitch for the Wellness Recovery Action Plan. You can Google it. Some of you are no doubt already using that. Very much a recovery focused instrument and a planning instrument. I'm in reasonably good health. I'm in reasonably good mental health. I'm taking prescribed medication to support my mental health. I'm taking prescribed medication to help my cravings for alcohol and other drugs. I have access to regular healthy meals. I have access to recovery support groups in my community. Not only I know they're there, but I can go to a group and feel accepted and feel like I belong. I am regularly involved with a local recovery support group. I have a sponsor or other mentor for my recovery. I have people who look to me as a mentor for their recovery. We know how important that concept of giving back can be in a person's recovery. And I can't count the number of times that I've dealt with people who have said, what I want to do now, they've completed treatment, or they've completed and they're graduating from a treatment court, and they say, I want to give back. That is an element of purpose, as we talk about one of the dimensions of recovery, and having people who look to you as an example can help keep you on the straight and narrow at times. I have completed or I'm complying with all legal requirements related to my past. I have recovery rituals that are a part of my daily life. There's lots of information about the value of rituals, the value of habits in maintaining the kind of life and the kind of progress that you want. I have goals for my future. I feel I am a part of my community. Services to others is an important part of my life today. So you can see, you can go through these, you can have, sit with an individual, you can talk about, what does this one mean? What is a recovery ritual? If you're a person in recovery, you can talk about what is your ritual every day. I was recently at a conference, and the individuals who had gone through a very powerful treatment program talked about their daily system, the thing they do every day. And there were like 5 things they said that they do every day. I have to tell you that one part of my ritual, my daily ritual, and I've heard others say the same thing, is I get up, I step out of my bed, and I immediately make it. That's a part of my ritual. So rituals can be very significant. And sitting with someone and talking about what is a ritual, what could it be, what might be meaningful, what might be helpful. So how can we help people build on recovery capital? In the first place, peer support is so important for helping an individual peer identify their own goals, and capable and competent peer support individuals, recovery coaches, help people identify their goals. Often we're involved in systems where we have goals for people. We're working with them to achieve those goals. Particularly true in the work that I've done over the past 15, 16 years in treatment courts. But in treatment, we have goals for people. And so understanding what those goals are, articulating them clearly is important. But we also, if we want people to be able to really harness the energies and the momentum for change, it has to be in achieving and working towards their goals. So a good peer support process focuses on helping an individual identify their own goals. I can remember very clearly in my own clinical work over the years, people saying early in the process, I don't know what my goals are. I don't think I have goals. People become very short-term focused in whether it's in their mental illness, whether it's in their addiction, or in times when they're really being troubled by their past trauma. And so helping people to really identify goals, and maybe they're just short, especially valuable short-term goals, things they can do in the next week or before they see you again. It's so important for people to have goals that they can actually see progress on. So be very careful that the goals are, they're clear, they are time limited, they are feasible within the time that's allocated to it. Peer support models the building of recovery capital. It's one thing to tell people ways of improving their recovery capital, but when you can say, here's where I was, as the woman told me 10 years ago, or actually it was 35 years ago, I had been a heroin addict for 10 years. But here's what I've done. And you can not only, you can see where she is, you can see that she's accomplished a lot, but she can tell you and she can model. She said, I still go to meetings every week. I'm still working the program every day. That is modeling recovery capital. That is modeling how you do this. Peer support shares their own journey with building up recovery capital. We often think, and sometimes it happens, that peers think what is important for them to share is what their life was like before. Well, that can provide some frame of credibility, but really what's important for peers to share is how they have built their recovery capital, how they have engaged in recovery, how they've come to the point where they're at. And people with, let's say, maybe 2 to 10 years of recovery are much better able to report how they have built their recovery. It's far more clear to them, the steps that they've taken. And so being able to share those steps, share how scary it was when some of those steps felt like, stepping off a really high place, but that they were able to do it. You're sharing your resilience in that recovery journey. Peer support helps the individual identify their existing recovery capital and set goals to increase their recovery capital. So often when you start working with someone, they'll feel like they don't have any. And so helping them to tease out, what are the supports that they have? What is the recovery capital in their life? Are they still working? If they're not still working, do they have a former employer they can go back to? Are they able to take some training? There's some important training opportunities becoming available to people. In Idaho, it's called Project Launch. And I'm sure there are other vocational training, vocational rehabilitation, particularly. Lots of vocational capital building opportunities, but people don't know about it. They don't even necessarily recognize how recovery capital supports their recovery. And so peer support can help them identify their existing recovery capital, realize they're really not starting from ground zero, even though it feels like it, and then set goals to increase their recovery capital. We're talking about peer support. I had this analogy come to my mind. Let's say you've decided that as part of your wellness program, you are going to hike part of the Pacific Coast Trail. Let's start small, not the whole thing, just a part of it. Well, so if you're going to prepare to do that and you're going to do that, are you going to, do you want to buy a hiking book? Do you want to buy a book that says, here's the segments of the Pacific Coast Trail? Some of them might be annotated a little. Or would you rather go with a guide who has hiked that trail before? And that is something that we can do to help the people we work with build their recovery capital, to help them engage peers, someone who's been there, someone who has hiked that trail, someone who has walked that recovery pathway for a while. So as this talk says, recovery capital equals resilience. And I really do believe it's a great way to really put some specific detail about the concept of resilience. Now, the dictionary says that resilience is the capacity to withstand or to recover quickly from difficulties. It's toughness. Psychological resilience has a definition of the ability to cope mentally and emotionally with a crisis or to return to pre-crisis status quickly. Does any of that sound like coming back from a relapse? And I could get on another soapbox of mine, which is that we use the term relapse very inaccurately. That relapse is not simply using a drug or stopping taking your mental health medication or being triggered by a trauma. It's not just that. It is a whole host of behaviors, of feelings, of emotional content that happens long before what we generally refer to as a relapse. So psychological resilience is the ability to cope with or to return to that pre-crisis, pre-relapse status quickly. And resilience, ultimately, the ability to call up appropriate assets from one's recovery capital. That's how I see resilience. And that helps us put a real specific set of activities and elements that we can help a person build their resilience. So how do we help clients build recovery capital? First of all, we help them recognize and build their recovery capital to set them up for long-term recovery. For a long time, a very long time, maybe still somewhat today, in treatment programs, in other kinds of interventions, whether it's treatment courts, diversion programs, even programs in incarceration that deal with treatment. We think about abstinence, we think about sobriety, we think about connecting with some kind of recovery support group. There is so much more, as we've seen in terms of recovery capital, that will help people to set them up and to help them envision that the goal is long-term recovery. Now, early on in the process of recovery, surely we want them to see recovery one day at a time. And ultimately, long-term recovery is built on a stretch of many, many, many days of recovery, one day at a time. But we can help people to recognize and build their recovery capital to set them up for long-term recovery. We can encourage them to build social capital. All the things, often, we focus a lot on that personal and psychological recovery capital, but helping people to build social capital through participation in support groups. And it's really important. And there are ways to do it. There are evidence-based practices and manuals and ways to prepare individuals to participate. And 12-step facilitation is one of those evidence-based, manualized programs to help people prepare for 12-step groups. And I think it's important for all of us in the treatment community and the treatment court community to recognize that when we simply send people to 12-step groups, we not only set them up for what may be a less than successful experience, but we actually endanger the validity, the ability of those 12-step groups to be effective. Because as they are inundated with people who are there because they've been sent and don't know what they're doing there, can undermine the very effectiveness of those groups and the their ability to serve their membership. Help clients gain human capital with tools to cope with high-risk situations. And there's that notion of tools again. And I say giving them tools without many opportunities to practice with those tools, with observed practice and independent practice and reported back practice, is really not giving people tools. Provide information about job training and employment opportunities to help them build human and community capital. Again, we often speak of clients having tools, but do we really focus on tools? Finding ways to demonstrate modeling of tools is more helpful than lectures about tools. It's more helpful than a hiking book on the Pacific Coast Trail. So consider some of these recovery resources. Active physical recreation and activity, sober socialization groups, 12-step and other mutual help groups, faith-based recovery support, health and fitness management activities, engagement in meaningful community roles. And that doesn't necessarily mean only in terms of recovery groups and recovery support. It can also be, serving on the board of an arts organization or another nonprofit. It can be reading to kids at the public library. There's all kinds of meaningful community roles. And that kind of leads to the notion of volunteer work. Getting involved in the National Alliance on Mental Illness, an engaging hobby or interest, vocational training, services, or other education. These are all recovery resources that we can help people to learn about, to access, and to participate in to a point of adequate mastery, that they become really they do become a tool. Some additional recovery resources: financial counseling and money management classes. Credit unions, banks do financial literacy groups, sober housing, nonverbal recovery resources. So, one of we all do a whole lot of talk therapy, or talk guidance, or talk case management. But there are nonverbal recovery resources. And at a conference that I was at just recently, someone pointed out that trauma lives in the limbic system. The limbic system is accessed through the right brain, not the left brain. And so we need to address trauma through the limbic system. And I thought that was a really a kind of a brilliant observation, and helped explain why things like yoga and one of my favorites, equine assisted activities and therapy. I just recently here in Idaho ran across something called the Warm Springs Care Farm. And the Warm Springs Care Farm is a place where people can go and interact with farm animals, with sheep, with goats, and of course there's yoga with goats, with chickens, one of the individuals I'm familiar with who is involved in a film that we are promoting called I Married the War, which is about the impact of trauma on family members of combat veterans. Well, in this film, this wife talks about her chickens and how important her chickens are, and how she goes out and takes care of the chickens, because you have to do it every day, how she goes out and talks to the chickens. This is very much a nonverbal recovery resource. Having a support animal. All of these things are ways of really addressing that activated limbic system, that activated sort of trauma response, that activated craving response. So think about what are the nonverbal recovery resources you can help your clients, your individuals that you're working with, find and access. Service and emotional support animals, service to others through volunteer and recovery organizations. One great way would be to volunteer at the Humane Society. I swear I couldn't do that. I would be bringing home all kinds of animals, but being able to spend some time and to do something worthwhile, and being involved kind of with that nonverbal recovery resource. Learning to be an advocate and participating in advocacy organizations and activities. There are training opportunities in how to tell your story effectively. There are things like community conversations to participate in, to explain, to expose people without understanding to the realities of recovery, as well as the realities of addiction and mental illness and trauma. Get trained to be a peer support specialist or recovery coach. Long-term recovery is not a destination. It is a lifelong process. Recovery evolves over time. My colleague that I spoke with a tenure as a heroin addict and now 35 years as a professional, her life has evolved so much over time. I know a number of people in long-term recovery, and it's a beautiful thing to see how their lives have evolved over time. Recovery is not linear. Recovery isn't something you get and then you just move on with your life. Recovery has setbacks. Recovery has speed bumps. Recovery has times when all the tools you thought you had and all the resilience you thought you built has deserted you in the moment. Recovery requires continued awareness. When we talk about relapse, we're talking about actions and feelings and emotions and behaviors that begin to happen long before the ultimate use or mental health decompensation or trauma response. Recovery requires both looking inward and looking outward. You have to look in at yourself, your attitudes, your practices, your behaviors, your foundations, and you have to look outward at people you're engaged with, at the life that you're living externally in the community. Recovery emphasizes connection versus isolation. There's some great material about addiction is disconnection, and that the solution to addiction is connection. And I think that's a very true kind of way of looking at it. And ultimately, one of my organization's real areas of influence and emphasis is recovery is health and health is recovery. And so as we say, recovery happens. So here are some resources, and there's a ton more. Google recovery. You can find amazing things on Google or through Google. Tip 64, incorporating peer support into substance use disorders. If you go to SAMHSA, to their website, to their publications, you can download tip 64. The Recovery Research Institute, the work of Dr. John Kelly and his colleagues at Harvard and Massachusetts General Hospital, the Recovery Research Institute has all kinds of resources at www.recoveryanswers.org. SAMHSA has developed and established an Office of Recovery. You can reach that through their website. Faces and Voices of Recovery at facesandvoicesofrecovery.org. And finally, the Peer Recovery Center of Excellence at https://peerrecoverynow.org. So those are just a few resources. And I appreciate your attention, your time. We don't have a whole lot of time left, but are there any questions, Jennifer?
It doesn't look like we've received any so far, but I have a couple of announcements that I could go through and see if
that would be perfect. That would be perfect.
Okay. Please remember to fill out our evaluation survey for today's webinar by clicking the link within the email we'll be sending out later today. I've also posted it up there in the chat box. We'll also be sending a link to the recording of this webinar, slides, handouts that Norma has mentioned. So just watch out for that email. It should be out later today or tomorrow. And join us for our next webinar on October 18th. It's titled Time Trends in Cannabis Use Disorder and Psychiatric Comorbidity, Individual and State Level Influences. And that's going to be presented by Deborah Hassan. So if you could join us for that next one, we'll also have more information posted on our website about that, or an announcement in our newsletter if you've signed up for that. Do we have any questions? So go ahead and type them into the chat box. I know it's a lot of information to go over within an hour, so people might still be absorbing that.
It's sort of like a stunned silence.
Yeah.
And I hope what we're hearing is the throwing open of the windows of our former ideas to take in all of this new information on resilience and recovery.
And you might have just covered all of it. You did a really great job of covering a lot of content. Looks like just a lot of thank yous for your time, Norma, that have been coming in. Great information. Thank you. Okay. Great. Well, it seems like you covered it, Norma. We really appreciate your time and for joining us today. Great content, and thank you to our participants for taking the time to join us today as well. We appreciate you.
And thank you to the ATTC.
Thank you, Norma.